Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, animals. We've been animal fans since we were two, since the first time we could recognize an animal, probably younger than that. I mean, all of us have pets, right? We probably learned our letters by watching animals and stuff, but, um, I mean, A is for what? Ant, B is for bee, buffalo, C is for cow, right? But I want you to know something. If I were to ask you right now, think of an animal, I'll bet you would think of an animal that is in the smallest group of all the animal kingdom, or of all of the animal kingdom subgroups, the phyla. Okay, and I want you to keep that in mind because we have a lot of misconceptions about animals. Just because when we think of the animal kingdom, we think of what we see at a zoo. We think of lions, tigers, and bears, and fish, and things like that. But we are way off in terms of the best representation of animals. And I hope that you guys learn a little bit about the animal kingdom today. We're going to talk next about, I'm going to show you some pictures here in just a second, but I want to cover the objective first. We're going to contrast and compare the characteristics and biological processes of invertebrates and vertebrates. And that's kind of one of the first places I want to start is vertebrates and invertebrates. Let me show you this picture. I just Googled the animal kingdom and I want you to see, it's kind of off screen right now, but I'm going to pull it up here. I want you to see the first picture that came up. And tell me something interesting about all of these organisms. This is a Google image search, and it gave you, the animal kingdom. And I'm just going to look here. I got a shark, I got a zebra, I've got a pufferfish, I've got an alligator, I've got a frog, I've got, I'm going to guess, a spider, a kangaroo, a lion, a butterfly, and a bird. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 10 or 11 organisms. Let's just say 10. 2 of those 10 organisms are invertebrates, and 8 of those 10 organisms are vertebrates. 80% of the organisms on this screen are vertebrates. And guess what? That is way off. Okay? It should be, what should be on the screen, if there were 10 organisms on the screen, it should be 9 invertebrates and 1 vertebrate. It should actually be 100 organisms on this screen, 99 invertebrates and 1 vertebrate. In fact, it should be 1,000 organisms on the screen, 999 which are invertebrates, and only 1 vertebrate. Let me see if I can show you a better picture. So you remember when we were talking about all the kingdoms are broken down into subgroups called phylum? Well, this is all of the phyla of the animal kingdom, and we have, I know it's a little hard to see, but we have Arthropoda, Nematoda, I can't remember all these names, I'm sorry, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's Gastropoda. Okay, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. That's 22 different phylum. Only one of which, this one right here, ding, 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 contains every single thing that you probably thought of as an animal. Every single thing that I showed you, 80% of the animals in that picture I showed you originally came from this one little itty bitty phylum, and it's actually fairly small. Okay, I mean, this only shows you the number. It doesn't show you the relative size. The number of arthropods outnumbers all the rest of these added up. So what I'm trying to get at is that we have to rethink the way we are looking at the animal kingdom. It is mostly weird little things like starfish and bugs and worms and other little things that live in the ocean, or even weird stuff like what we call porifera. This a sponge. You ever seen a natural sea sponge? Yeah, that's an animal. Okay, and when we think about relationships, we got to really rethink the entire kingdom itself, because if you were an alien studying this, or a computer studying this, or something that had no investment in being a human, you would probably consider humans to be fairly irrelevant. I mean, even among the chordata, you've got the reptiles and the fish and the birds and the what did I miss there? You got fish, reptiles, birds, and the amphibians, and then you got the mammals. And the mammals are just really the smallest group, and humans are only one of them. And just because we're the most successful doesn't really put us too far ahead of the rest of these guys in terms of importance. And so there's a lot going on in the animal kingdom besides just, lions, tigers, and bears. So let's talk about animals. We come across various animals every day, including our fellow humans. Yes, you're an animal. Yeah, I know. Some of you guys think you're proud to be an animal. I've watched some of you eat. You're not too far removed from my bulldog. But have you ever stopped to think about what separates animals from plants or organisms? They come in all different shapes and sizes. I mean, look at the 3 different animals you can see in this screen, and look at the different shapes and sizes. And actually, those 3 animals are reasonably closely related. But they all have some characteristics. Even the ones on this page. Every animal on this page, every type of animal on this page shares some characteristics. They're all multicellular. Now, what does that mean? That they're made up of more than one cells. Even the little guys. There's some of these things on here that are almost microscopic. Some of these things live inside of you, but they're all multicellular. There are no single-celled animals. They're all eukaryotes, which means that they have that more advanced cell structure. They're not small, little, very simple and basic cells. They're actually large, very complex cells that have all kinds of little organelles and different structures inside of them that perform different tasks. You're a eukaryote. If you were to grab any cell out of you, whether it's a skin cell, blood cell, bone cell, hair cell, top of your head, bottom of your feet cell, it doesn't matter, we would find in it some of these complex structures. Mitochondria, we would find Golgi apparatus, we'd find a nucleus, we'd find all kinds of things in there. That's what eukaryote means, by the way, is it's got a true nucleus. And that means we're part of an advanced group. But don't forget, protists, plants, and fungus also have the same structure. So it doesn't separate us out too much. Okay, I mean, it makes you as special as a mushroom. But animals are also heterotrophs, which means that we cannot. And I found this out the other day. For every one of these things, there's an exception. There's this little bitty slug-looking thing that has photosynthetic cells on it that it can actually absorb sunlight. But other than that little guy, everything else, every other animal that we've ever found is a heterotroph. It cannot produce its own food. It must consume others for food. Now that separates us away from plants, but it does not separate us from fungus. Okay, so heterotrophs are not that unique. Fungus are heterotrophs. Protists, some of the protists are heterotrophs. Even some of the bacteria are heterotrophs. So that's nothing unique. Here's something that's kind of neat. Animals do not have cell walls. Plants and fungus both have cell walls. Animals don't, and that actually helps us to be able to move. Believe it or not, animals can move. Their bodies are motile, right? But animals lack cell walls, so that doesn't give us much structure. When you think about a plant, what makes a plant able to stand up and hold itself upright is that every single cell has like an extra little layer around it, kind of like a box that protects it. I used to give the example of, cells are like water balloons, but plant cells are like water balloons put inside of a box, and that box actually provides a little bit extra structure to it, right? We have seen incredible diversity in the animal kingdom. There's incredible diversity in practically every kingdom, but in the animal kingdom, there's a lot. I mean, we're talking about everything from, where's it at? Here. A human, to a starfish, to a sponge, belongs to the same kingdom as us, right? To an earthworm, to a beetle. We're talking about, this is a nematode. It can actually grow inside of you. I mean, there's just so much different diversity that goes on in the animal kingdom, and so there's no single rule other than they're multicellular, they're eukaryotic, they're heterotrophs, and they don't have cell walls. That's about the only characteristics they share. Now, we are going to talk about evolution, and yes, I'm sorry, but the scope of this class requires that we assume evolution is real. We're not going to argue that, okay? So biologists have long debated how animals evolved. We know that it goes all the way back to an ancestral protist, okay? We're talking about a protozoan that from which came plants, from which came fungus, and also from which came animals, right? And it started out with being multicellular. First thing we notice is that all animals are multicellular, but not all animals have varied tissues. Some of them are very simple, like sponges. So that's the first kingdom there, or the first phylum, Porifera. They're just sponges, okay? They do have tissues, but it's only one type of tissue. It is literally one of the simplest organisms on Earth, okay? And then the next thing to evolve as we got going down the list here, and this is, by the way, time. As time goes by, these evolutionary steps occurred. So one of the interesting thing about chordata is that we're one of the most recently evolved things, but we'll get to that in a minute. The next thing to evolve after multicellularity was a diversity of cells or tissues, okay? And that includes excuse me, everything else in this line that's not a periphery, okay? Bilateral symmetry is the next thing. Bilateral means that you can split it only one way. Like if you can imagine yourself, you can cut yourself right down the middle, and you're pretty close to being equal on the sides, but I couldn't cut you any other way. So bilateral symmetry was the next thing, and that rules out the jellyfish. They're what we call radial symmetry. And so the cnidarians, the jellyfish organisms, they have radial symmetry. There's no symmetry in porifera. There's radial symmetry in cnidaria, but everything else has bilateral symmetry, okay? Now, the one thing about the flatworms, or the platyhelminthes, which literally means flatworm, is that they don't have an internal body cavity. I want you to think about yourself. You have, starting at your mouth, going all the way through you to come out the other end, a body cavity, at least one, right? And so the platyhelminthes doesn't have a body cavity. And so everything else, the nematodes all the way over, they have body cavities, but the flatworms don't. So that makes it interesting, right? And then there's this thing called a coelom, which is actually several layers of body, and kind of like rings on a tree, but you have actually several layers. We're going to talk about the coelom in a minute. But the coelom, the nematodes don't have it, but everything else does, okay? Then there's kind of a split this way. We go with segmentation, which is found in the annelids and the arthropods, but the mollusca doesn't have it. So that's the next round, okay, is that we can look at these things in segments. Earthworms have segments. Arthropods have very defined segments, and of course arthropods are the bugs. This is the largest phylum of the animal kingdom, and the segmentation is very interesting. You have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. With Annelida, you have a front and a back, is the easiest way to tell you, okay? Something happened with these, the organisms that went this way involved an endoskeleton, or an internal skeleton. And yes, oddly enough, you are more closely related to a starfish than you are a bug, okay? The endoskeleton, the Echinodermata, turned into the starfish, and there are a bunch of different starfish. I don't know if you knew this or not. But then that left us with the backbone, which is all the chordata, and the first one was some kind of a very simple fish, and then it started to get more complex, and then you got the bony fish, and then you got the fish with the jaws, and then you got the fish with these lobes on them that turned into able to walk on land, and then the walk on land turned into the amphibians, and then the amphibians turned into the reptiles turned into the birds, the reptiles also turned into the mammals, and there you go, you got us. So really weird stuff, but notice that as time goes by, okay, something really interesting happens, because the most complex creatures up here are the chordates, the vertebrae, the ones with the vertebrates. So as time goes by, another interesting thing that we note is that there are certain organisms that become highly evolved. Some organisms just quit evolving, they just stop, okay, they're fine, they work great, there's a place where they live, and they don't need to change, they work great. But after a while, you see these truly advanced organisms, and of course among the chordates you have all of the vertebrates. That's the things with a spinal column, all the fish, all of the amphibians, all the reptiles, all the birds, and all the mammals. And the mammals are, you know, highly complex, and then including that you have humans, the most complex thing on the earth, some people think. Now that picture you just looked at is called a phylogenetic tree, and it just defines major groups of animals based on their design, or it really did how they're evolved, but what evolves always is the shape of the organism and the structure of the organism. And if you remember that, hold on, let me just go back real fast. One of the first things to break loose was tissues, right? So let's talk about these tissues. So the first key transition is the idea of the formation of tissues. All animals except sponges have tissues. These tissues form in the embryonic stage. Cells start to what we call differentiate. You know, you start out as a single cell, and if you think about it, every cell in your body comes from that. Skin cells, blood cells, bone cells, hair cells, I can't talk, teeth cells. You know, you got thousands of different types of cells in your body, and they all come from that original cell. And what happened is in the embryo, as it's developing, whether you're a human or a fish or, you know, whatever, you start to differentiate. Now, I'd like to point out that other kingdoms have tissues too. Plants, fungus, they all have tissues, okay? So tissue development kind of evolved independently in all three of those kingdoms. But with with the animal kingdom, some of these organisms, including most of the invertebrates except for the sponges, develop these tissues. And you can see that it first starts in the stage called the blastula, and then it turns into the gastrula. Now, you start with a single cell. They grow and divide, grow and divide, grow and divide, and you get a bunch of them, and some of them turn into these blue cells. There's a name for them, I forgot. And some of them turn into yellow cells, and then as it grows even more, look, you get even more types of cells, okay? And you start developing what's called the ectoderm and the endoderm, okay? And this is interesting because this ends up being, depending on the organism, this ends up being either the mouth or the anus. And guess what? Humans, this ends up being the anus. Yeah, okay, anyway, so let's go on. Okay, so I'm going to want to bounce back and forth with that original picture, so just to make life easier, I just did it here, but look, it cut off periphery, sorry about that, but you see the point. After tissues, the next thing to evolve is bilateral symmetry, so take a look at this. Remember me telling you that the jellyfishes and stuff, they're called the cnidarians, right? Yeah, the cnidarians. They don't have what we call bilateral symmetry. They have what we call radial symmetry, meaning that I could pick like straight up and down here, and I could cut it in any direction, slice it this way or slice it this way, and I'd still get an even thing. You can't do that with anything else, okay? Only the cnidarians have radial symmetry. Every other animal has bilateral symmetry. This grasshopper, I could only cut it right down the middle here. That's the only line I could cut to get an even on thing on either side. Now, we don't like to cut. We don't. It's not like we go around cutting these things going, oh, look what I can do. But I'm just saying the symmetry or the shape of the body is, in this case, only different from top to bottom. In this case, it's different from left to right. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, and this does insinuate a higher development. Okay, so then what's next? The next thing to evolve was the body cavity. We're going to talk about that. Now, the next thing to happen was that things, these organisms started to develop a body cavity. Inside of the body cavity, these bodies are referred to as coeloms, but there's actually several types. There's what we call acoelomates. That's well, as we look here, that's the cnidarians, okay, and the platyhelminthes, and the nematodes are what we call pseudocoelomates. They have what looks like a coelom, but it's not really there. And then you have your true coelomates, which is everything from mollusks up, right? But what do these cavities do? Well, they help with circulation, they help with movement, they help with organ function. These cavities allow your organs a place to be, and they're surrounded with other they're surrounded with other tissues, they're surrounded with a fluid, and they kind of help keep the organs separated. This only happened when you get a higher organism, in it, a highly developed organism. So the next level of evolution involved actually coeloms, which are these things right here. And there's three groups of organisms. There's those that have a coelom. That's going to be these gaps right here. In humans, we would find organs and lungs and all kinds of stuff. We're coeloms. You have these groups called pseudocoelomates, which have an area and it's fluid filled, but it doesn't necessarily have organs in it necessarily, not like you would see in the advanced coeloms. And then you have the acoelomates. They're the ones that don't have a coelom. Now, let's just be clear, all right? Acoelomates don't have a fluid filled body cavity. Coelomates do have a true body cavity that are fluid filled, and pseudocoelomates, and that's going to be these guys right here, these nematodes right here, this group, the roundworms, all right? The roundworms have the kind of the pseudo means fake, so they have a cavity. It is fluid filled, but it doesn't really. It's only partially filled. It doesn't really have the tissues and organ development like a true coelomate does. All right. So then that takes us to, after that, we're going to talk about some of the coeloms segmented, and some of the coeloms became ones in the endoskeleton. So let's see what's next. Yeah, we're going to go to the left. We're going to talk about segmentation. Now, segmentation just means that the bodies are divided into numerous repeated parts or segments, and it improves flexibility and locomotion. Now, this is an earthworm. It is from the phylum Annelida, and Annelida literally means segmented, I think. And you can tell that there's these rings, and these rings are all considered segments, okay? And you'll notice that there are areas of the worm that have a slight difference to it. By the way, this is its head and this is its tail. And as you go down, this is where the reproductive organs are. And the rest of this thing is just basically intestines and fluid-filled sacs to help it move. It doesn't really, I mean, it has muscles, but it's not like this is all muscle all the way down like you would see on like a snake or you know, something. So let's see what's next. Yep, so the last thing, one of the last things to truly separate everybody is, one of the last things is the endoskeleton. There are only two groups, the echinoderms and the chordates, that have an endoskeleton. If you've ever been inside of a starfish, I wish we could dissect a starfish, because right down the middle of the starfish there's this, it's called a radial spine, and that is considered to be an endoskeleton. Endoskeletons are the, you know, the internal bones. Now this snail, which is a snail, is, I want to make sure it's a mollusk, okay? It has an exoskeleton, the shell, right? Only the chordates and the echinoderms have an endoskeleton. Now it does provide the same, they do the same function, okay? Provide structure and support, but the endoskeleton on these two phylum allow for much more mobility. They're actually more mobile, they grow differently, they grow better. The exoskeletons on these guys form as they go. Each one of these layers is formed. That's how it grows. It keeps adding layers. Okay. If you look at a bug of some kind, like let's say a beetle, they have to shed their exoskeleton before they can grow anymore, and it's a disadvantage because while their exoskeleton is gone, they're very vulnerable. That doesn't happen with organisms with an endoskeleton. The endoskeleton grows as it goes. So the endoskeleton and the echinoderms and the chordates, and then the last one will be the vertebrae. So we're going to take a look now at the invertebrates. That's going to be, we're going to go back to this and we're going to talk about, I know you can't see periphery there, but we're going to talk about everything from echinodermata all the way down. These are all invertebrates, okay? Just because echinodermata has an endoskeleton doesn't make it a vertebrate. The only true vertebrates are in the phylum Chordata. Everything else is an invertebrate, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 phylum that we're going to talk about. And I think there's actually some phylum hidden in here. But so first thing I want you to know is that 98% of all animals are invertebrates. Okay, they don't have backbones, but they are animals. They fit all those animal categories, and we're just going to look at, or fit all those animal characteristics. We're just going to look at a few of the categories here real fast. The first one are the sponges. That's the ones all the way here to the left. They have no symmetry. They have no tissues. They're just the simplest form of animal life on Earth. They do technically fit the category of animal, and they were probably some of the first to appear on the Earth, and they haven't really changed much. And that doesn't mean evolution isn't real because they haven't changed. It just means that the environment in which they thrive is still around, so some of those still here. Now there is some change, but not much. Okay, they are what we call filter feeders. You can imagine them as kind of like being a cup, and they pull. They're called filter feeders because they have a kind of a muscle that pulls the seawater in through the sponge, and then it shoots it out the top. It's called an osculum. It shoots it out the top. You can see these holes here. So there's a constant flow of filtered water coming out of these holes, and then these guys will filter feed, and anything in there that they can eat, they'll just kind of absorb into the body. The main thing to remember is that they don't have any tissue. They can regenerate. They're really interesting how they regenerate. You can actually cut these things in half and throw them in the water. Sponge farmers will do that. They'll pull up a sponge, cut it in half, keep half of it, and throw the other half back, and it ensures that they've always got sponges because they'll grow right back. It's pretty crazy. The next group are going to be the cnidarians. Now the cnidarians are the first ones to show symmetry. Remember, they have the radial symmetry, so pick any line that goes up and down, and I can cut it in any cake, you know, like I'm slicing a cake, straight up and down. But there are a couple of types of cnidarians depending on the orientation of the organism, but they can move. They usually have specialized stinging cells called cnidocytes that they're used to kind of grab a hold of their food and eat it like a fish or something. there are two body forms. There's the polyp and the medusa. The polyp is tube shaped, it's surrounded by tentacles, and is sessile, meaning it kind of sticks to the side of something like a barnacle, and then it just eats things. Sea anemones are polyps. The medusas are mobile, they move around, and basically they're just the same thing upside down. They have a really interesting life cycle, and they start out upside down, and then depending, some of them stay this way, they stay upside down, and then some of them they kind of butt. It's like you ever pull coffee filters out of a pack of coffee filters? That's what this is kind of like, and they just kind of like fling one off, and that becomes a jellyfish, which lays eggs and starts all over. And this can throw out several like this. It's kind of crazy. They do reproduce sexually and asexually. By the way, that's sexual reproduction is not necessarily found in animals. Lots of animals reproduce asexually. The more simpler ones do. By the way, this is called the alternation of generations, which is something to read about. Half the time they are diploid and half the time they're haploid, which means half the time they have a full set of DNA and half the time they only have half a set. And that's really all you need to know. Haploid means half the DNA is really what it means. And they're right here. These are the cnidarians. And after that, we're going to get into the worms. But there are two or three kinds of worms here that we're going to talk about. So we might be covering several phyla here. Worms can be found in freshwater, in oceans, on land. They can live inside of plants and animals. You have worms inside of you right now. It's a practical guarantee. The first type of worms are called the flatworms. That's these guys right here, the platyhelminthes. If you speak Spanish, I'll bet you that's what that means. Tell me if I'm wrong, but platy probably means flat, and helminthes probably means worm or something close to that, right? Flatworms are members of the phylum Platyhelminthes. They're acoelomates, which means they don't have a coelom at all, no internal body cavity. They're thin, they have flat bodies, but they have a distinct head. Most of them are parasites, which means they live on other organisms to get their nutrients, but some flatworms live free, like this one. Flatworms can reproduce either sexually or asexually. If it gets split in half, each half can kind of regenerate, but they also have the ability to reproduce sexually. Another type are the roundworms. These are the phylum Nematoda. You've probably heard of nematodes. That's this phylum right here, Nematoda. They are coelomates. I think they're pseudocoelomates. So they have an internal cavity, but there's not much development going on in there. They're unsegmented, but they do have bilateral symmetry, which means you can only cut them one line down the middle. A lot of them are aquatic, some live on land, but a lot of them are parasites, and they reproduce sexually. They only reproduce sexually. By the way, it is an absolute guarantee that you have one of these living in your intestines right now. The next one are the rotifers. They're members of the phylum Rotifera. They are technically worms, but they have three distinct parts: the head, the trunk, and the foot. They have a circular arrangement of tiny cilia. This isn't a really good picture. I don't like this picture, but these cilia help them to move around. So they kind of look like a rotating wheel when they move. That's why they're called rotifers. That's what rotifer means, is wheel bearers. Like roundworms, they are pseudocoelomates, so they don't have a true internal development like the coelomates do. And they can reproduce sexually. And then the annelids. Now when you think of worms, this is usually what you think of as the annelids. This is phylum Annelida. Now this includes earthworms, leeches, ragworms. If you have, fish and worms are annelids. They have a lot of characteristics similar to the next group we're talking about, as mollusks, suggesting a common ancestor. They have a coelom. They have a closed circulatory system. And they have very distinct organs inside of them, and these organs are found inside of these body cavities, or these coeloms. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about are the mollusks. Now when I say mollusk, you're going to be surprised, because it includes things like snails, but also includes things like clams. They have a head to foot region, a visceral mass that contains all the internal organs, and a mantle or a layer of tissue that surrounds the mass, and that mantle turns into the shell. They have a unique feeding organ called a radula. It's rows of teeth, which are used for scraping food such as algae and bacteria off of rocks. Believe it or not, snails have teeth. Isn't that crazy? And they have two openings to the digestive tract. Some have a shell, some don't. They have an open circulatory system where blood is not enclosed in blood vessels. and the heart pumps at a lower blood pressure, but it does allow the blood to get all the organs directly, and that's why they move slow. They don't move very fast. They can move, but not very fast, because they don't have a circulatory system. We've got our gastropods. These are the subgroups of the mollusks. We got gastropods, gastropoda. Gastropod means stomach-footed, which means that they, I don't know, they're just one big long slug is what it means, right? They have a shell sometimes. If you find a slug, whether or not it has a shell or not, you're looking at a gastropod. The bivalves are the clams. Bivalve, they have two sides to it. This includes clams, oysters, and scallops. And then you have your cephalopods, which include things like the octopuses, the octopi, maybe that, I don't know which is the right word. They're cephalopods because they have a distinct head and foot, just like the other mollusks, okay? But they have a modified mantle that can squeeze out water, creating jet propulsion to escape threats. There's just a lot of diversity here. So I think this is the last group of invertebrates. These are your arthropods, your echinoderms, and your invertebrate chordates. Now, I personally put invertebrate chordates in with the chordata, but these guys, this is a real gray area here. But your arthropods are the largest group of invertebrates, and you know, they're generally what you think of when you think of bugs, either freshwater bugs, saltwater bugs, or land-based bugs. And yes, when you eat a shrimp, when you eat a crab, you're technically eating a bug. They're more closely related to grasshoppers and spiders than they are to anything else. They have they belong to the largest invertebrate phylum called Arthropoda. Arthropod means jointed foot, and as you can see, they have joints. All right. It includes lobsters, spiders, crabs. They're all related. They're true coelomates, but they have a segmented body, and you can see several segments here. You can see the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. The body segments of arthropods can be divided into three, or sometimes they're fused together. Sometimes the head and the thorax are fused together, right? But they have an exoskeleton, so and it doesn't grow. This doesn't get any bigger. So as I've told you before, in order for this organism to grow, it has to shed this exoskeleton and grow and kind of secrete a new one. And until that new one dries, it's very vulnerable. And this process, by the way, is called molting. They have, there's a couple of types of respiratory systems here. The marine arthropods basically have gills, which are just feather. In this case, they're feather-like. They don't really look like a fish gill, but they're feather-like. And if you ever seen a feather get wet, that's exactly what it looks like. They're up in here, and they kind of wave these things back and forth inside of this shell. They move you'll see them, they're constantly twittering their legs because they're attached to these gills, and these gills have to be constantly moving, but that's how they breathe, right? Land-based insects or arthropods have what we call book lungs, which look more like if you're ever taken a paperback book and kind of fanned it open and fanned it out, that's what theirs look like. And they have to move those around so the air, the gas, instead these have liquid moving over their gills, but the land-based ones have a gas moving over their gills, but they have to move them back and forth. One of the coolest things you can do is grab a grasshopper and look real close at its tail. I'm going to go back to the grasshopper. Look real close at its abdomen area. This is where the book lungs are, actually right in here. But in here there's these things called spiracles, and this whole tail right here will expand and contract to move the air across the gills or the book lungs. It's a really cool thing to watch, especially if you have like a magnifying glass. Just grab it by its head so that you can see the tail or the abdomen, and you'll watch it as it expands and contracts. It's kind of crazy to see that's how they breathe, because we think that they breathe into their mouth and stuff, but they don't. It's all back here. Arthropods have an open circulatory system, which means they don't have blood vessels or anything. They just have a heart that just kind of pumps, that just kind of stirs the fluid that they call blood. Their blood is called hemolymph, right? And it just kind of stirs it around. It transports oxygen. You can read all that, but it's just like a big goopy stuff on the inside. Most arthropods undergo metamorphosis, which means that they go from a larval stage to an adult. And you know, you guys have seen that. Butterflies and grasshoppers, a lot of them, now they don't all go into a cocoon, but they all go through some kind of a larval state. Now the echinoderms are interesting because while echinoderm means rough skin, and that includes things like the sea urchins and the sea stars, the starfish, that sort of thing, they're the first group of animals to actually have an endoskeleton. Everything else has an exoskeleton. These have an endoskeleton, and that endoskeleton is found on the inside. If you've ever dissected or if you ever looked inside of a starfish, you can see the endoskeleton. They also, one thing about echinoderms is they tend to also show radial symmetry. So radial symmetry came back with these guys, but it's not the same as like a cnidarian, because especially with starfish, it's usually what we call penta-radial symmetry, because it usually has 5 sides to it, not total radial symmetry like you'd see in a cnidarian. And this is the gray area I was telling you about, the invertebrate chordates. They have a centralized chord, which would be the beginnings of a nervous system like vertebrates have. They have this area that goes down their back. Either it's a dorsal nerve cord or a notochord, and they start to show vertebrate characteristics like the pharyngeal slits and the postanal tail. But the truth is that they're not considered vertebrates because they don't have a bony spiny structure. Well, yeah, I mean, they really don't have to have a bony spiny structure because cartilage works too, but they don't have anything like that. But they do have that central line, that dorsal nerve cord. So this is where we started to see our first vertebrates, kind of, even though we don't consider them vertebrates. Read this: chordates are mostly vertebrates, so few are invertebrates. So this is the gray area. This is the transition. Okay, and so now we finally get to the vertebrates. You know, the vertebrates are probably the most advanced form of life on the earth, and they have changed and adapted and evolved over time to become very versatile and also very diverse. You are looking at a whole bunch of mammals, keeping in mind that mammals are probably one of the smallest groups. Here's a picture of vertebrates that contain no fish, no reptiles, no amphibians. I see mammals and birds, but you know, that's what we normally think of. A horse would probably be what a lot of you came up with when I asked you to think of an animal. Vertebrates are chordates, which means that they have that central line of nerves. That central line of nerves here it's a dorsal line, which means it goes down the back. And it happens to be encased inside of a bone structure that protects it. The front end of the dorsal nerve ends up into a brain, and all vertebrates have that. There are 5 main classes. There are amphibians, fish, reptiles, mammals, and birds. So let's look at each one of them. Coming out of those chordates that we were looking a little while ago, those pseudo-invertebrates or pseudovertebrates, they turned into fish. Some of the first vertebrates were fish. They live in water. They have gills and fins, and they're covered in scales. Amphibians are vertebrates that are believed to have evolved from fish. Believe it or not, I know this sounds crazy, but frogs evolved from fish. And I think how we get from one stage to the other is a little weird. There are fossils that help us, support this, but from fish to amphibians is a little hard to go, isn't it? But look, let's talk about fish. They're aquatic, so they live all their lives underwater. They breathe using gills. These are organs that, each one of these little slits is surface area for passing water across it. The water contains oxygen, so they pull in oxygen through by passing water across these layers. Then of course carbon dioxide comes out. Now consider a shark, a whale, and a dolphin. Seeing the similarity in their structures, you'd think they're all fish, but they're not. Sharks are fish because they have gills, while whales and dolphins are mammals. They have lungs. They breathe air, so they actually can't breathe the water. Okay, so whales and dolphins have to come up and breathe periodically, but most fish are what they call ectothermic, which are cold-blooded. They cannot produce enough body heat to keep them going, which means they have to find warm areas, or when they're cold, they have to do things like go dormant or something else before they can function. So the main thing about ectothermic means is that their body temperature depends on their environment. Okay, and you find this in fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Most fish have jaws, and that's not a play on words. They actually have jaws that hinge. That's a new thing. That was bones. Bony development was something that happened inside of fish. Whether they are hard bones or cartilaginous bones like sharks, sharks don't have hardened bones except for their teeth. Everything else is just kind of soft cartilaginous. Another thing is that fish have paired fins, meaning that they helps them swim. These create a balance for steering, and you're going to see them here. They got the little pectoral fins. They have scales. Now the scales were there for protection. And then finally they have a single looped circulation, which means that they have a blood system similar to what we have, which is veins and arteries, that sort of thing. It's kind of like that. So amphibians lead two lives. That's what the term amphibian means, and it's kind of weird because they literally meet this characteristic in several ways. They're ectothermic, which means they're just like fish. They're what we would call cold-blooded. What ectothermic means is that they're, if the temperature outside goes down, their body temperature goes down. If the outside temperature goes up, their body temperature goes up. They don't regulate their body temperature. They spend their early stages of life in the water. They have gills as they're young, and they use those gills to breathe. Later they undergo a metamorphosis, and they get rid of the gills and develop lungs. So they become land dwellers, which is interesting. These are the first land dwelling organisms, right? The first land dwelling vertebrates. There were already bugs and plants and other things on the land when they came on land. A few species live underwater as adults, but even those must come up periodically to breathe. But there's something interesting. Yes, they have lungs, and they do breathe through their lungs, but they also have something weird. Their skin is porous, meaning that they can actually breathe through their skin, which means that they don't have to get all of their air through their lungs, which is kind of weird. Just like fish, they fertilize externally. The female lays eggs in the water, and the male goes by and delivers sperm onto the eggs. Now the idea is that as these amphibians lived on land, and they grew and adapted to live on land, then you get this new class called reptiles. They are four-legged. They're ectothermic, which means they're cold-blooded. Which isn't a good term, but you know what it means, right? They can't regulate their body temperature. They have to live wherever the environment is, whatever the temperature is in the environment, which is why you don't find a lot of reptiles where it's cold, or a lot of amphibians. All right, they have several adaptations for living on land. They can live in water, so they go back and forth. Some of them can. They have lungs to breathe air and hard scales to cover their skin for protection. They lay eggs on land, and the reptiles include snakes, turtles, and crocodiles. Reptiles were the first vertebrates to practice internal fertilization, so they actually copulate, and the male fertilizes the egg inside of the female. Most reptiles lay eggs that are what they call amniotic. It has a hard shell, and it protects it from the external environment. The shell is also porous enough to let gas exchange come in and out. And not all reptiles lay eggs. Some species of snakes actually give birth to live young, so they're also the first vertebrates to give birth to live young. Now the theory is that reptiles turn into birds, and this was starting to happen before the great extinction of the reptiles. You remember the comet that hit the Earth in what they call the KT event, and it pretty much signaled the end for most of the large dinosaurs. there's a theory that the large dinosaurs went extinct because as the comet hit the Earth, it threw all this dust up into the air, and in the atmosphere was blanketed with dust, not letting as much sunlight in, so the Earth got cooler. A cooler Earth meant that there was no place for these reptiles to do well. You remember they're ectothermic, which means they spend a lot of time in the sun getting warm. And when the sun's not there, then you don't do very well. Plus, the amount of vegetation on the Earth had to drop tremendously, and so large organisms like the big brachiosaurs and stuff like you see, even the tyrannosaurs, they just couldn't get enough food, and so the large ones died off, leaving only the small ones. Now, at the same time, there were some that had already started to develop feathers. The scales that they had elongated and became essentially feathers. If you take a look at a feather, you'd see that even though it feels kind of fluffy, when you look at it really close, it looks just like the same as scales on a reptile, but just kind of longer, and it splits to make it fluffy. Now this did something very interesting. It provided a warmth, a layer of protection to keep the organism warm, and all of a sudden now we have organisms that are endothermic, meaning they're what you would consider warm-blooded. They have the ability to regulate their temperature. Now, it's not just the feathers. There had to be a change in the biochemistry, but it happened. They were able to warm themselves, and the downy feathers kept the organism warm, kept the babies warm, and they were able to survive the cold environments. Okay, they have forelimbs modified into wings, and we saw this with dinosaurs. These used to be legs, but they turned into wings. They have strong but lightweight skeletons. Birds have, the whole thing about a bird is that it is light. It's not very heavy. For its wingspan, it is considered to be very light, which means that they can fly. They have the feathers, they protect them from the cold temperatures, but they also lay eggs. So they lay the eggs that are hard-shelled. So they have some characteristics of reptiles. They theoretically came from reptiles, but the differences are that they became mainly endothermic, which allowed them to survive that cold temperature change back in the KT event, and it allowed them to become very diverse. They're one of the most diverse of the animal groups, and they have learned to live in so many different places. They live all around the world, on land, on the water, and in some cases a lot of them even underwater, such as penguins. And they have adapted and changed quite a bit, so they're very interesting creatures. And then finally we have the mammals, and the ones we're most familiar with. They're endothermic, which means that they can regulate their body temperature. They breathe through lungs. Hair covers most of them. Pretty much all mammals have fur, but some of them, like the elephant, doesn't have much fur. It just kind of lost all of its fur for various reasons. Some of them are covered in fur. It provides insulation as well as protection from water and other elements. The color patterns can serve as camouflage, and hair, actually, believe it or not, can be sensory receptors. The whiskers on a cat is an adaptation to where it allows the cat to do some sensing. It even helps in the cat's balance. Interesting, a crucial characteristic of mammals is that they give birth to live young. Now, this isn't unique. Remember, there were some snakes that did that, but the mammals all give birth to live young. No eggs. Well, everybody, there's the platypus, and we just put the platypus over in a corner. We just ignore it, except for things like the platypus. They give birth to live young, which is an advantage, because now you don't have to care for the egg externally. It stays internal. You can move around. You don't have to worry about it freezing because it stays warm inside the body. And when the offspring is born, in many cases, the offspring is already up and moving around by the end of the day. Okay. Also, female mammals produce milk. In fact, that's where the term mammal comes from. It comes from milk. It means milk producer, and they do it to feed their young. So one of the main reasons that mammals evolved the way they did was because it helped them better care for their offspring, gave them a better chance of surviving. So now instead of laying a bunch of eggs and hoping to survive, you can actually hope that all of your offspring survive. So you don't waste time developing, or waste energy and time creating all these different offspring, hoping that only one or two survive. Most mammals produce a small amount of offspring, and they hope that that small amount of offspring, all of them survive. Some of the largest animals in the world include elephants and blue whales, or mammals. Dogs, cats, and humans are also mammals. So that's it. That's all of the animal kingdom. I know it got weird. Okay, it covers everything from sponges to jellyfish to flatworms to intestinal worms. Yeah, I could tell you stories right there. To snails and mollusks, to fish and worms, to bugs, to starfish, and then to all of the things that we think of as mammals. So, or not mammals, but all of the chordates, including the fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals. So lots going on in the animal kingdom. But I think you are familiar with a lot of what's going on there because you've been taught it before. So it shouldn't be too tough. But remember, they all came from a protist. I think about 1.5 billion years ago or something like that. But a very diverse kingdom of organisms. Okay, that's it. Get to work.